Howdy! So I've just received this package from my friends at Alpha 6 Paints, which contains a very cool do-it-yourself sign painting kit that they put together. And with this kit you'll be able to create this neat little hand-painted coffee sign. So if you've ever considered trying your hand at traditional sign painting, this kit's a really great way to get started as it contains everything that you need to make this sign. And in this video I'm going to be showing you step by step how to make it. So if this looks like something that you think you wouldn't mind having a crack at, there's a link below where you can order the kit from Alpha 6 and they'll ship it right out to you. Alright, so let's get this unpacked and see what we've got.
Okay, so I've got a nice sticker. You can't go wrong with a good sticker. And there's the kit itself that has the panel, the paints and the brushes. And we've got our paperwork which contains the finished colour layout along with a few basic instructions. So we can keep that handy and follow along as we're painting the sign. And we've got a full-sized template there. Now we've got some carbon paper as well. The paper that you receive in your package will actually be all white. We'll have a look at that later. Slightly different, but the same thing. And there's our full-size template that we can use to trace the lettering onto the sign. All right, so let's get this opened. Okay, so of course we've got our paint, we've got our dark red, our black, we've got some brush oil, some reducer, the ivory and the light red. And we've also got this nice little paint palette that Alpha's given us to work out of. Let's rip the plastic off that. And of course we've got brushes. Now you can see I've got 3 brushes here, but your kit will contain 2 brushes, a size 2 and a size 4. And then of course we've got the sign panel itself, which comes with this protective plastic, so make sure you remove that. And that's everything we need, and now we're good to go. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do, we're going to take our reducer. Now you'll get a bigger bottle than this one. This one's just a little sample that I've got. We're just going to put a little bit of reducer on a rag and just give the panel a clean. Of course, we've already removed the protective paper. So I'm just going to give it a wipe with the reducer and then buff it off with a dry rag. And that'll just get rid of any greasy fingerprints or residue from the plastic. Next up, I'm going to take my template. The first thing I'm going to do is just trim the corners off the layout, and that's going to allow me to register the layout onto the panel just by lining up the corners like that. Next thing, I'm just going to use some painter's tape just to secure the panel to the table, just to stop it from sliding around during the layout process. Now the paper that you receive, you'll see it's white on both sides, so I'm just going to check which side works. So that side doesn't work. Let's flip it over. And that's the side that works. You can see that's giving me a nice solid white line there. This is called Sorrel paper or Sarrel paper. And this is really good stuff for tracing onto a glossy surface. So I'm just going to cut the paper down to size, secure that with some masking tape as well, once again just to stop that from sliding around as I'm working on the tracing. And then we're going to take our template, realign that, get those corners registered so everything's nice and straight, and secure that down as well. Now I'm going to use a biro, or rather a ballpoint pen, just to trace on there, just because it's a nice hard writing implement. And as you can see, I'm just using dotted lines. That's the way we draw lettering, especially with curves, rather than trying to draw a solid line all the way around, which can be a bit difficult. We just do dotted lines, and that's a much more efficient way of producing a curved line because there's not really any straight lines on this casual style. So what I've done, I've drawn the lettering first, and now I'm going to do the shade. And then I'm going to come back and do the outline and cast shade, which is the black portion. And I'm just doing it in sections like that just because for me it's easier to keep track of what I've done, just instead of, you know, tracing random lines. So I just like to do the letters, then I'll do the shade, then I'll do that final outline, cast and shade. Okay, now just using a ruler just to trace in that border line that goes around the edge, rounding off the corners, once again just with a dot 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 type of scenario. Remove the paper. Now you'll notice I've left the template taped to the table, and I do that just in case I need to put it back down in case I missed any bits. But this looks pretty good. I've got it all in one go, so that's always good. And now we're traced and ready to start painting. Now with your brushes, give your brushes a wash out in just some lukewarm water and some soap just to get the gum arabic out of the bristles. That's ready to go. Of course, give that brush a good spin and a dry so there's no water in the hairs, as this is enamel paint, so we don't want any water getting in there. When you open up your bottles, just use a screwdriver to pop that top red cap off. It's just a safety cap. Okay, now I'm just tipping out just a little bit of paint into the pellet there. That's probably too much, you really don't need much. And I'm going to put some reducer in the little reservoir just beside it, which I'll show you why. So we're going to start with the size 4 brush, which is the larger brush of the two. That's the one we're going to use to paint the lettering. And I'm going to use this brush to pellet some reducer into the paint. Just get a nice consistency, because paint out of the container is usually a bit too thick to use. So as you can see, I'm just dipping it in and just introducing a little bit of reducer into the paint and thoroughly mixing it. So we don't want the paint too thick and we don't want it too thin. We just want a nice mixture that's going to flow off the brush without being too draggy and also without being too thin and slippery and impossible to control. So I'm going to spend a bit of time just doing that. And another thing with these brushes is they should be pelleted into a nice square chisel shape, just like that. As you can see there, I've got my chisel pelleted and ready to go. And I'm just using the hand over hand technique here, or you might say a hand over arm technique, where I'm just resting my right hand on my left arm for some stability, and just so that I'm not touching it down onto the sign and making a mess. Now, normally when I paint a sign like this, I like to work vertically on a vertical easel using a mole stick. But if you're buying this kit and trying everything out for the first time, you may not have a vertical easel and mole stick set up. So I'm just doing this video this way, as I figure this is probably going to be the most straightforward way for most people to do this. And of course, if you do have a vertical easel and a mole stick, you know how to use all that, well, by all means, go ahead and do that. Now, notice with the brush, once again, I'm always working it into that nice chisel shape. And a few tips with the brush, you can see I'm flattening out the hairs as much as I can. And as I'm going around the corner, I'm twirling the brush in my fingers. So I've always got what you might call the imaginary headlights on the brush, always facing in the direction that I'm driving the brush. Okay, so you can see there, I'm twirling the brush in my fingers as I come around, rather than just holding the brush in the one position and dragging the hairs all over the place sideways. Very important just to twirl that brush in your fingers and just keep that chisel formation always facing forward. As you can see, I'm going around there, I'm twirling the brush. See, I've given it a big twirl there. And that's the correct way to use a brush, is always chisel it into a nice, or rather pellet it into a nice chisel shape. Get that nice square end on the brush. And as you can see there, I'm just using the edge of that little cup to pellet the brush. Normally I'd actually work out of a little Dixie cup like that. I'd mix my paint up in there. I'd put the paint and the reducer into that cup and mix it up, which you can also do. But because Alpha Enamel have given us this little palette, I'm kind of using that as well. But I just find using that cup to really spread those hairs out on the brush and get a nice chisel just works a bit better for me. So if you've got a Dixie cup, by all means use it. And as you can see, I'm using nice long strokes to really spread that paint out as smoothly as I can. Alright, always reloading. Always make sure that your brush hairs are completely saturated with paint. That's another thing. You don't want to just have a little bit of paint on the tip of the brush like you might do with a house painting brush. With a lettering brush, we want that paint worked all the way into the ferrule of the brush. Okay, so as you can see, I'm coming around here and I'm twirling the brush. See how I'm twirling it in my fingers? Because I want to keep that chisel formation always facing the same way. And if you imagine there's imaginary headlights on the front of the brush, I always want those headlights facing in the direction that I'm brushing, just like as if you were driving a car. Okay, now this is your first time doing this. You might find this a bit challenging. You may not be able to do it quite as quickly as what I'm doing here, but that's okay. It all takes practice. Another good tip when using the brush is keep it as perpendicular to the working surface as you can. Alright, so you want to keep that brush as close as you can to 90 degrees to the side, rather than laying the brush down flat. That can be tempting to do because it might feel a bit uncomfortable trying to spread those hairs and apply pressure to the brush while still keeping control of the hairs. But you really want to just, you'll see I'm not keeping the brush at a perfectly perpendicular angle to the sign, but fairly close, as close as I can, because what that allows me to do is just twirl the brush and direct the brush around the letter, kind of like a plotter. So you can see it's a very tight curve there, so I'm just going on the tip of the brush, a little bit of a sideways drag there on the brush just to get that really small area, or that really fine stroke painted in. And once again, a little serif on top of the letter there. Once again, this is a pretty small little fine area to paint this crossbar on the F, so I'm just going to use the tip of the brush, just gently just bring it around that curve, blend it back into the main stroke. Okay, so moving along onto the E, no need to show you two Fs. The E is basically the same thing, just with an extra stroke on the bottom. Another thing with painting lettering also, you'll notice, or maybe you've noticed as we're going through here, I don't just paint around the edge of the letter like a racetrack and then fill it in. I'm treating each section of the letter as basically a single brush stroke. So what I've just done there on the E, if I was doing a single stroke casual E, that vertical stroke would be just one thick brush stroke. And then the three crossbars, or the three horizontals, would all be obviously three extra strokes as well. Because that's the way that you'd write an E. If you were just writing a freehand single stroke alphabet, you'd do your downstroke or your vertical stroke. That'd be a single stroke of the brush, and then you just do 1, 2, 3 for the horizontals. So like I said, the idea with painting lettering, even when it's sketched out like this, is not just to paint all the way around the edge of the letter as if you were going around the racetrack. Treat each section of the letter as if it was a single stroke. So for example, the O, you'll notice I painted the left hand stroke first, and then I completed the other half of the O by doing the right hand side of the O. Rather than just painting around the outside of the O in one big circle, I just treated it as the two natural brush strokes that would normally make up that letter. Once again, just on the tip of the brush, just to do that really fine skinny stroke on the E. Finishing off that last E now, just on the tip of the brush there. Alright, and of course once again just smoothing out that paint, getting that paint smoothed out as best I can and covering as best that I can, and there's our first coat of ivory on the coffee sign. So of course we're going to come back and second coat that lettering, because it's usually very difficult to get a light colour to cover over a dark colour, so there's nothing wrong. In fact, it's quite common to come back and second coat a letter like that to get nice coverage. Now here I am, I'm just washing the brush out. I've got some reducer in that little cup. Give the brush a wash, and then I'm going to put some cleaner reducer into that cup just to get the very last remnants of paint out of that brush. Give it a spin and a dry out, and then we get our brush oil. This is to keep the brush moist in between uses, so if there's any leftover paint or solvent in the brush, it won't go hard. So we just use the brush preserving oil there, give it a nice massage, shape that chisel, just pellet it back into that nice chisel shape, massage any paint out of the ferrule that might still be in there, shape the brush back into its chisel shape, and there we go. Excess paint back into the container. Now I'm going to go straight on to painting the red shade now, and for that I'm going to use the smaller brush. So we use the larger brush for the white. Now we're going to use the smaller number 2 size brush for the shade, just because it's a smaller and more fiddly area. Okay, so all the same things, mixing in a little bit of reducer, not much. I'm probably going to keep this paint a little bit thicker just because I'm painting such small, tight areas. It'll just work a little bit better for me if I don't have the paint too thin. But once again, with paint consistency, just experiment a little bit with it, with how much reducer you put in, and just get a mixture that feels nice. It should flow off the brush without being too runny or hard to control. And also, you don't want it too thick and draggy. If you find you're just not getting a nice smooth stroke and the paint's just feeling thick and almost like it's half dry, then that means it's too thick. Alright, so just experiment. You don't need to put much reducer in, just enough to get a nice flow. Also, as I'm painting this shade, it may be a little bit hard to see on the screen there, but I'm not painting all the way up to the letter because the letter is still wet because I've literally just finished painting that. So I'm keeping the red just a little bit, maybe about 1 millimeter or 1/16 of an inch away from the edge of the ivory color. And I'm doing this, of course, because I don't want the two colors touching, because with that lighter color still being wet, if I was to accidentally paint into that, I wouldn't be able to wipe it off because the white or the ivory is still literally wet. It's only just been painted. So I'm just leaving a slight gap in between the red and the letter. And that little gap will be covered up with the black outline when we come back and do the final stage, which is the black outline. That'll cover up that little gap, and we can use that black outline to just tidy up any little imperfections that we're not quite happy with as well. Now you'll notice where the light red, which I'm painting now, meets the dark red, there's basically a 45-degree angle where the color finishes. When you're painting a shade, it's important to keep that angle consistent on all your lettering, because that basically represents the angle that the light's shining in on the letter, or the imaginary light source. So just with those angles where the light red finishes, where it connects with the dark red, just be conscious to keep all of those angles consistent. Just taking my time here. Of course I want to get this done as efficiently as I can, but definitely don't want to rush the job. I just want to make sure I do as neat a job as possible. And another thing to keep in mind is don't be too much of a slave to the guidelines. It's more important to focus on things like consistent angles and consistent thickness of the shade around the letter, rather than prioritizing just following the guidelines exactly. And that completes the light red portion of the two-tone block shade. I'm going to give the brush a little bit of a washout now. A bit of wipe, get any excess paint out of the brush. Now, I'm not going to put oil on it this time because I'm going to go straight into using this dark red. Okay, so if there is a little bit of light red still mixed in there with the dark red, that's fine. I can just pellet that through the brush and you won't even notice. And once again, just making sure that I've got a nice consistency. I don't want it too thin, I don't want it too thick. The thinner the paint is, the smoother it'll flow, but if it gets too thin, it's very hard to control. And also, the thinner it is, the harder it is to get to cover. So the thicker the paint, the better it should cover, but then it may not flow. So you just got to get that happy medium. Okay, so this time, once again, I'm not painting all the way up to the letter because I don't want to encroach on that wet paint on the word coffee. But I am painting all the way up to that light red that we just did. Okay, so of course that light red is still quite wet, but because we're just joining it up with a very short area, it's not that difficult to do. It's much easier just to paint these two colors up to one another, that being the dark red and the light red, than it would be to go all the way around the letter trying to get it perfectly up to the edge. So that's why we leave a little gap around the letter. Just getting the last of that dark red in, and whoops-a-daisy, you can see that I've gone over the white or the ivory there, which is what I don't want to happen. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to come back just while it's still a bit wet, and I'm going to cheat, I'm just going to very carefully dob some ivory on there, and that covers it up rather than trying to wipe it off. Alright, and there's our two-tone red block shade. And next step, now straight away, because once again I'm not painting over any wet paint here, so I'm going to go straight into painting the border. Now there's two ways you can do this. You can use tape like I'm doing here. I've got some professional fine line tape. If you don't have that, you can actually use cello tape, but just make sure you test it first and make sure that the tape you're using doesn't leave adhesive when you remove it, because that'll ruin the job basically. And also just check if you're using cello tape. Sometimes it can be quite brittle and fragile, and when you try and remove it, it can break off into little pieces, and that's also kind of a deal killer. Regular masking tape won't work as it bleeds on the edge. And of course the other way you can do this is just freehand without tape. So you might wonder why I've only got two sides taped up here. It's just because I want to show you both ways of doing it. Normally I'd probably run tape all the way around the edge, but I'm going to do half and half here just to show you two different ways. Alright, so I'm going to peel the tape off, and that gives me a nice, perfect, straight, sharp edge. Of course, make sure you rub the tape down properly so it doesn't bleed underneath. And then I'm just going to come in and finish off those corners very, very gently and carefully, just round in those little radiuses. Now for these two edges, I'm going to do freehand. And of course, this does take a little bit more skill and a bit of a steady hand, but that's the other way to do it if you don't have tape. And sometimes you can't use tape. Sometimes the surface may not allow you to use tape. It might be textured or fragile. So that's why it's good to be able to work without tape as well. I find it's quicker with tape, but you know, it's good to have the skill so that you can get by in the event that you can't use tape. So I'm just going to carefully go along here, nice long straight strokes. Got the hairs flattened out, got my brush as perpendicular to the surface as I can while I'm doing that. Rounding in those little corners, smooth it out. And there's my border. Now I'm not going to pick that up because everything's wet. So I'm going to let that dry. You want to leave your sign or your paint dry for at least 24 hours. If it's super cold where you are, you might leave it a bit longer. If it's boiling hot, sometimes you might be able to go back at the end of the day and second coat. But 24 hours is usually a pretty safe bet. And here we are back on the job for stage 2. I've checked that my paint's nice and dry, and now it's time to give the colours that we laid down in the previous session a second coat for some nice coverage. So I've actually left this for a couple of days because I had to go off and do other things, but this paint is all nice and dry now, all the stuff that we did in the previous session. So now I'm just coming back to give it a second coat. And also, so I slipped and went over the edge there. That's just a simple wipe off. We're definitely allowed to do that. And that's another reason you want your paint thoroughly dry for the second coat, so you can do things like that. If it was a bit touch and go with the dryness of the first coat, I may have wiped off some of the first coat with that rag, which would have been a bit of a pain. Okay, so let your paint dry thoroughly before you give it a second coat. And basically just coming back and doing exactly the same thing that we did on that initial coat. Once again, see, I'm keeping the brush nice and chiseled, keeping it as perpendicular to the surface as I can. I have 3 rules when it comes to brush use. That is, keep it chiseled, keep it perpendicular, and twirl it. Alright, so keep that chisel palleted out as wide as you can in that nice square shape. Keep the brush as perpendicular to the work surface as you can, and twirl it in your fingers as you go around those corners. As you can see around here, twirling the brush, keeping that chisel formation facing forwards all the time. And nice smooth strokes. Spread that paint, lay that paint off nice and smoothly, and get it to cover as best you can. Jumping forward and just finishing off that last bit. When you second coat, try and go right to the edge of the letter. Basically you're painting the same letter again. Don't cheat and not quite go to the edge. Try and get as close to the edge of the letter as you can, obviously without going over it. But you really want 2 accurate coats on that lettering. Coming back, second coating the shade, light red, the dark red. Once again here I'm going for coverage. This is the idea of the second coat, is to get the colour to cover. And while I've got that dark red going, another coat on the border. Do it all freehand this time because I've already removed the tape. See, I've got the brush nice and perpendicular and the hairs mostly flattened out. I'm using about 2/3 of the hairs. And there's our second coat. Once again, give the brush a wash out, give it a double wash and some preserving oil. Put that aside, and that's stage 2. Now we're going to let that dry for another 24 hours at least before we come back and finish it off. Now it's time for the final section. We've got our black enamel, once again mixed up to a nice consistency. And this will be probably the most challenging part, which it always is for me, is the outline, because we're doing a very fine line around the letter. And when we're outlining, you can see I'm just using the tip of the brush. We're using the small brush here, the number 2 size, and I'm just using the tip, but I'm still taking care to pellet that little skinny tip into a chisel. Just because it's a very fine line and we're just using the tip of the brush doesn't mean we don't keep it chiseled. Rule number 1. So we're still keeping it chiseled, we're still keeping it as perpendicular as we can, and we're still twirling it in our fingers. Well, you can see I missed the edge of the letter a little bit there, but that's okay because I'm just going to come back and give that a bit of a touch up, and that whole inside section is going to be painted black anyway, so it doesn't matter that I've gone a little bit thick with the outline on that particular piece. But for the most part, I want to keep that outline as consistent as possible all the way around. And as I mentioned earlier, this outline will fill that little gap that exists between the red shade and the letter. That's why we don't have to paint the red right up against the letter, because now we just fill that gap with the black. As I said, outlining is quite challenging, even for me. I find this the most fiddly and difficult part. So if this is the first time you've done this, or one of your first times, I just recommend just having a bit of a practice on another panel or on the wall or somewhere, just to get the feel for outlining, rather than just going straight onto the sign if you've never done it before. Just fix up some black and have a bit of a practice, get your paint consistency right, get the feel for just painting nice thin lines just using the tip of the brush, and that'll make your life a lot easier once you come to do the actual sign. Just like playing a sport, have a bit of a warm-up first and then go and do the real thing. So I'm painting a bigger area here. This cast or black cast shadow represents a shadow being cast on the wall by the sun, because our red is an imaginary 3D effect. So what we're representing here is a 3-dimensional letter, which might be a foam letter, something cut out of foam or fabricated out of aluminium, and the red is the return of that letter, or the edge you might say, and that black is the imaginary shadow that you would see on the wall if the sun was shining down from the top left hand side of that word, casting a shadow down to the right. So I'm just being very, very careful. Once again, just taking my time. There's no rush. There's no set time that we have to get this done in. We just want to do as nice a job as we can. Like I said, if you're feeling new to this, you probably won't be getting through this as quickly as I do, because I've been doing this for many years. And that's just from practice. You know, the more practice you have, the better and faster you'll get at it too. One of the good things about using a dark background on a sign like we have here, which is the dark green, is when you do come to do a dark coloured shade or outline, the contrast is fairly low, so you can get away with a few imperfections, more so than what you would if you were doing a high contrast background. For instance, if this background was bright yellow, it's a little bit more difficult to get away with any slight flaws around the edge of that black. Okay, so there it is. We'll let that dry, and there's our coffee sign.
Okay, so I'm quite happy with the way that's turned out. I think that's a nice colour scheme. We've got some nice warm earthy colours there, which I think are very coffee-like colours. So if I saw a coffee shop or a cafe painted with those kind of colours, or designed with those kind of colours, I think that would entice me in, because when I think of a coffee shop, I'm thinking of a nice warm cosy environment, and I think those colours certainly indicate that, as opposed to cold colours like blues. You wouldn't want a coffee sign painted in blue, because I personally associate blue with frozen food or fish or ice cream, that kind of thing. So it's pretty important to choose the right colours when you do a sign, and I think we've done okay there. So if you want to make this sign, like I said earlier, there's a link below in the description where you can click that, and that'll take you to the Alpha 6 website where you can purchase the kit to make this sign. And if you do purchase the kit, you might just find within that kit a 15% off discount code for one of my online courses if you want to do some more sign painting learning. Okay, so thanks for making it this far in the video. It was a bit of a long one, but I just wanted to take you through all the steps and give you a good understanding of what it takes to create this sign, especially if you have bought this kit. This should serve as a good instructional video to help guide you through it. So happy sign painting, and I'll see you on the next one.